I had just pulled into my driveway after a long day at work when I spotted flashing lights near the community pond. A police cruiser sat parked by the water's edge, its reflection rippling across the surface. My stomach dropped. In Pinecrest Meadows, police visits were rare. And when they happened, they usually meant one thing. Our HOA president, Brenda Vance, had found another target for her power trip. As I jogged toward the pond, I could already hear her voice, sharp, shrill, and commanding, slicing through the quiet afternoon air. And there she was. Brenda stood proudly behind a young police officer, arms crossed, chin raised like a queen about to hand down judgment. Facing her was Arthur Pendleton, a 78-year-old man who'd lived in this neighborhood longer than anyone else. He sat calmly on his favorite bench, fishing rod in hand. The line stretched across the still water as if none of this concerned him at all. Brenda, of course, was in full uniform, a crisp blazer, pressed slacks, and that ridiculous HOA president badge pinned to her lapel like she was the sheriff of Pinecrest Meadows. Her short blonde bob bounced with every furious gesture as she jabbed her finger toward Arthur. The officer looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. He tried to reason with her, but Brenda just kept talking, louder, faster, as if volume equaled authority. I didn't know it yet, but what was happening by that pond would soon strip our HOA of control over $2 million worth of waterfront property and end Brenda's reign for good. Let me take you back to how it all began. Arthur Pendleton moved to Pinecrest Meadows in 1992, back when the place was mostly farmland. The pond wasn't some luxury community feature back then. It was a quiet public fishing spot that locals had used for generations. His modest ranch house sat on 3 acres, the pond forming the eastern boundary of his property. For more than 30 years, Arthur had followed the same routine. Every morning, coffee in one hand and tackle box in the other, he'd stroll down to the water and fish in peace. He was part of the soul of this place. Then, 2 years ago, Brenda Vance arrived. She bought a massive McMansion at the top of Maple Ridge Court, and within 6 months had pushed her way onto the HOA board. Within a year, she'd made herself president. From that day forward, Pinecrest Meadows wasn't a community. It was a kingdom, and she ruled it with a clipboard and a threat of fines. First came the mailbox regulations, then an approved color palette. Every shade of beige and gray you could imagine, but nothing else. Next were the landscaping requirements, so strict that it felt like we were maintaining golf courses instead of front lawns. But her newest obsession was the pond. She decided it was an exclusive HOA amenity and that anyone using it needed to pay for access. That Saturday morning started like any other for Arthur. Around 7, he walked down to the pond, coffee steaming, tackle box swinging gently at his side. He'd barely cast his line when Brenda appeared, marching down the gravel path in a full power suit, heels clicking like gunfire. In her most official tone, she announced that effective immediately. All pond access required HOA approval and a $50 monthly permit. Arthur just smiled, tipped his hat, and kept on fishing. That's when Brenda lost it, according to my neighbor, Nancy, who'd been walking her dog nearby. Brenda stood behind Arthur, reading from a stack of HOA bylaws in a furious tone. When Arthur didn't respond, she threatened to have him trespassed. And when that still didn't work, she called 911. By the time I arrived, half the neighborhood had gathered. We all knew Arthur, and honestly, most of us were fed up with Brenda's nonsense. People started filming the scene, whispering to each other, shaking their heads. The officer, a young guy who looked barely out of the academy, tried to mediate. He asked Arthur if he lived in the neighborhood. Arthur nodded and pointed toward his house, visible through the trees. Then the officer turned to Brenda. "Ma'am, what exactly is the issue here?" Brenda launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech, all about HOA bylaws, community rights, and preserving shared assets. She even waved a manila folder in the officer's face, claiming it contained proof that the pond belonged to the HOA. And of course, she couldn't resist bragging that the property was valued at over $2 million. The officer skimmed through her papers, frowning. Then he asked Arthur if he had any documentation of his own. Arthur set his fishing rod down, opened his tackle box, and pulled out a faded envelope. Inside was a deed from 1992, the original property deed. The officer took it, studied it carefully, then stepped aside to make a call. The crowd went completely silent. Even Brenda stopped talking, though her foot still tapped impatiently. 3 minutes later, the officer hung up, cleared his throat, and said the words that changed everything. "Ma'am, according to the county records, the pond and a 50-foot easement around it were never legally transferred." To the HOA, Brenda blinked. "That's impossible," he continued. "A clerical error during incorporation left it under public trust. And according to this deed, Mr. Pendleton has retained specific access rights to the property. In short, not only could Arthur fish there, he might be the only resident legally allowed to." Brenda's smug smile vanished. Cameras caught every second. Within minutes, chaos erupted. The truth spread through the crowd like wildfire. Neighbors started checking the HOA website, scrolling through lists of fines and fees tied to pond access. Someone yelled, "Do we get our money back?" Another demanded to know what gave the HOA the right to charge them in the first place. Brenda tried to regain control, her voice shaking as she demanded to speak to the officer's supervisor. But her authority, like her composure, was slipping fast. An hour later, 2 county officials arrived. They confirmed everything. The HOA's ownership claim was invalid, and the error could even affect the community's property values. Leading the team was Eleanor Sterling, a stern, no-nonsense county administrator who wasted no time. She issued a cease and desist order right there beside the pond, demanding that the HOA refund every dollar of pond-related fees and halt all enforcement actions immediately. She also announced a full audit of the HOA's property records. And then, with everyone watching, she told Brenda to issue a public statement. Brenda stood before the crowd, her voice trembling as she read from a sheet of paper. Behind her, Arthur kept right on fishing, perfectly calm. She apologized for the misunderstanding and declared that all pond restrictions were lifted. The crowd exploded. Some people clapped, others cheered. A few even asked Arthur if they could join him. For the first time in years, Pinecrest Meadows actually felt free. That evening, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. 3 members resigned immediately, calling Brenda's leadership reckless and embarrassing. The remaining board voted to bring in a lawyer to assess damages. The legal findings were brutal. The HOA owed thousands in refunds. And losing control of the pond had stripped the community of over $2 million in asset value. Even the HOA's insurance company began investigating whether Brenda's actions amounted to negligence. But the deeper investigators dug, the worse it got. Months earlier, Arthur had actually tried to warn her. After one of her first meetings, he'd approached Brenda with that same envelope, the deed. He'd explained the easement situation calmly, even offered to show her county records. Brenda had waved him off. "Old-timers like you need to accept that things change," she'd said. What she didn't realize was that Arthur's family once owned all the land Pinecrest Meadows was built on. When developers bought it in the 1980s, Arthur's father had negotiated special terms. The pond would remain open to the public, and their family would always have permanent fishing rights. It was all there, in black and white. The story soon reached the local news. The headline read, "HOA President Calls Cops on Elderly Veteran Loses $2 Million Asset." And yes, Arthur was a Vietnam veteran. A fact Brenda could have known if she'd ever bothered to talk to him. The insurance company's audit uncovered more dirt. Brenda had been sending out cease and desist letters, threatening residents with legal action she had no authority to pursue. She'd collected over $15,000 in pond permits. That now had to be refunded with interest. Worse, she'd convinced the board to take out a loan for pond improvements, using the pond as collateral for a property the HOA didn't even own. When residents filed complaints, the state attorney general's office got involved. They discovered Brenda had been listing the pond as an HOA asset on official documents, a move that bordered on fraud. Her real estate license came under review. The following week, the HOA held a special community meeting. The clubhouse was packed, every chair filled, every corner crowded. Years of frustration finally boiled over when the treasurer revealed the total financial damage. Not just the $2 million in lost assets, but another $800,000 in potential legal liability. The entire room gasped. Brenda tried to defend herself, claiming she'd acted in good faith, but the crowd wasn't buying it. People began shouting examples of her abuse of power. One woman mentioned being fined $500 for painting her mailbox the wrong shade of beige. Another reminded everyone how Brenda had threatened to sue a disabled veteran over his wheelchair ramp. The vote to remove her was overwhelming, 212 to 3. As the numbers were read aloud, Brenda stood frozen at the podium, mouth opening and closing, speechless. Then came the second vote to pursue legal action against her, personally for negligence and misrepresentation. That passed 198 to 17. The HOA attorney announced that Brenda would be held personally liable for any damages resulting from her actions, over $300,000 in civil penalties. Then someone in the crowd shouted, "The state's investigating you for fraud. It's up to 50 grand in fines and 5 years in prison." Brenda's composure cracked. She gathered her papers, heels clacking wildly on the linoleum floor as she ran from the room, sobbing. Outside, her Mercedes roared to life. She sped out of the parking lot and vanished into the night. Since that day, the pond has been quiet again. Arthur still fishes there most mornings, the ripples spreading across the same water his family's protected for generations. The HOA has a new president now, someone a little humbler, a little wiser. And every time we pass that pond, we remember the day the Queen of Pinecrest Meadows finally fell from her throne. Thanks to one man, one deed, and a whole neighborhood that finally said, enough. And if you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe to HOA Conflicts for more.